How's it going, everyone? Hope you're doing extremely well. So this week I'm going to be doing a two-part gameplay discussion on modern game design and how it's affecting our gameplay experiences. And so for today, we're going to be discussing how modern game design is affecting our replayability of games. And I think that there's no better way to discuss this than with the latest Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I've been playing this game since early February as my main playthrough, and at the time of me recording this video, I am roughly 3/4 into the game's main narrative. So I'm actually hoping to complete the game by the end of this month. But a lot of people, when I ran the poll and announced that my next game I'd be playing would be Assassin's Creed Valhalla, made the joke that they weren't going to see me until next year, and just how significant the entire game felt in terms of a complete experience. And when I started playing the game, I wasn't immediately drawn in, and I played all the mainstream Assassin's Creed since the very first one when it released. And still to this day, I truly feel that Assassin's Creed 2 was the peak of the series. It is a game I would gladly replay today, as I feel it boasts strong characters, a well-crafted world, fun missions, and mission variety, as well as a thematic narrative that just pulls everything together, And, here we are now over a decade from that game's release. At the latest entry in the series with Valhalla, it's bigger and, quote, better than, in every way. And it's got a much larger world, probably over 10 times the amount of content. It's got a huge variety of characters. It goes into mythology and tells a character-driven narrative. So with all of that, why do I feel that this game isn't worth a second playthrough? Or rather, why do I feel that if you missed out on this game, you really didn't miss out on much? So we've seen this past generation now a huge sweep of commitment to open world design in video games, and games that previous entries in the series weren't open world to begin with have seemingly gone open world during this past generation. Even Assassin's Creed changed its genre from an action adventure open world game to a full-on RPG with dialogue options and multiple endings. One may say that's the evolution of the series, and that the game changed because the audience changed and it needed to accommodate. But as I play Assassin's Creed Valhalla and I'm nearing 40 hours into the game, I never felt that this game truly appreciated my time. I can appreciate how slow a game starts and, character development, and Assassin's Creed Valhalla certainly has those, but the delivery of its content and the extremely formulaic approach to everything it does made what in actuality was my 40 hours in the game so far into a grind and what felt more like 80 hours. Valhalla suffers from the same boring, repetitive design choices that plagues many of the open world games today. It's formulaic. You have tons of missions, but your approach, your objectives, and even at times the outcomes feel like you're beating a dead horse. I've done this before. I've seen that before. I've been here before. This is what accumulates the vast majority of my experience with Assassin's Creed Valhalla so far. And I find that the best moments of the game are this small side story revolving around the actual Norse mythology, in which you actually visit these incredible places like Asgard, Jotunheim, and indeed Valhalla, from what I understand, where the game breaks off and starts telling a new story about a political power struggle within the Norse mythology, and you're interacting with these gods. And all I was saying in these moments was, why isn't this the actual game? It's infinitely more enjoyable and interesting than anything that goes on in the actual game's main narrative. And the characters are much more deeper than, and even though they aren't as fleshed out as much, you get the sense of their presence and significance as, in the face of everything that's going on within that story. It's like Assassin's Creed has fallen victim to its narrow design to tell a story that takes a twist on actual history. But at this point, Assassin's Creed has already disregarded the main narrative that it was telling back then when it started. And we have this sort of RPG-esque cookie-cutter experience now, which asks you to commit to it tens of, or even hundreds of hours in order to fully experience everything it has to offer. I have a friend who's a humongous Assassin's Creed fan, and before I started Valhalla, I personally messaged him asking if he's completed the game and what he thought of it. And every time I did, he had ignored me. However, I reviewed his trophies on PS5 and found that right now I have actually surpassed him in not just the game's main story, but the trophies I collected as well. If a fan of the series has abandoned the game, and I also want to add that he's British, so it can't be from like a lack of interest in the history, because I mean, it's his country's history. But if a fan can't be asked to complete your game, then there is something terribly wrong here. No one in their right mind would even consider to play your game down the road. It's like the developers think, oh, if we overfill them with content, they'll be playing our games for months. But you can't ask people to spend hundreds of hours of their life in your game if it's boring as shit. No one's going to do that. And thus the longevity of the game is actually diminished because a lot of people don't end up actually fully playing the game. They leave, and that is something that we're going to be discussing more in detail towards the end of the week. But replayability is all but dead because of this past generation's insistence that more content will drive people to play their games longer. But in actuality, it's actually driving more people away. I can't tell you guys how many times I started a game and was intimidated just because it thrusts you into the world and gives you hundreds of shiny icons on your oversized and unnecessarily large map. It's like, where do I start? What's important? Which side missions are the best? Is this part of the main story? And if it wasn't for my unfortunate curse of being so persistent with trying to play the games to completion, I would have moved on to much better, shorter, but significantly more impactful experiences by now. This is not sustainable. Game design needs to accommodate logic and have respect for its players, and by no means am I saying that games shouldn't be as long as Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Sure, make them as long, but there's a difference between content that's meaningful and others that's wasteful. There's a huge difference when you ask players to overtake another settlement for the 18th time versus having them do some espionage and partake in interesting gameplay. And perhaps it's again that the victim that Assassin's Creed by nature is so formulaic as a series. Like perhaps it's the limitation of the game's own genre and the series' own credibility that doesn't allow for such a broad scope of variety and meaningful contents. Like this is unfortunately the best it can be, or it has to reinvent itself again. But at the end of the day, I'm just much more likely to return to a smaller game that ends up being so much more enjoyable and so much more fun because it doesn't overstay its welcome. And even a game that wasn't necessarily as interesting maybe the first time around, I'm much more interested in going back to replay that game. I'm actually much more encouraged as well to go back and replay that game if it wasn't so long, like if something was 10 to 15 hours. And that's what I feel every game needs to learn from the latest Assassin's Creed. So I will continue to play it. I will beat the game, but I'm the exception now versus the rule. And although I've played, again, all the mainstream games in the series, this one, like so many other Assassin's Creed titles, will barely be remembered after I complete it by myself. And even if it was so memorable, and it was so engaging, and it was the best this series has ever been, the asking price in this case, the time required to actually experience the entire game, is just too much to bear for a second run through. I'm far too busy, I got far too many other games to play, and I've spent far too much time already in the game to complete it in the first place. So what do you guys feel like? Do you think that modern game design is really discouraging your replayability of games? Have you guys tried Assassin's Creed Valhalla? Have some of you guys beat Assassin's Creed Valhalla? Ultimately, what are some games that you really, really enjoyed, but you wouldn't necessarily go back for a second run? I myself, it's a bit interesting because I made this video a while back about how replayability is very important and that you should replay your games because it does yield a different experience. It's so discouraging when we see a lot of these modern games come out with open world designs. Again, in the case of something like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where it's going to take me, already 60 hours to play the game, sort of at a minimum, I would say. I'm already going to be spending tens of hours into the game, hundreds of hours if I want to, basically do all the missions. It's so discouraging when you have a game that asks you to partake that much time, to give it that much time. You would never play, for me, myself, I would never play this game again. But I want to know what you guys think. Are any of you guys fans of Assassin's Creed at all? Do you feel like Valhalla is a good game? Honestly, I could say this, is that although I haven't beat Valhalla, by design, it is a good game. There's nothing technically wrong with the game. There's some glitches here and there that I'm seeing, little small things that, are kind of funny and stupid when they happen, but nothing so game breaking. I would say as a complete experience, it's functional. There is some significant quality in there, but again, it's so formulaic by design that basically it's just not particularly interesting. And even if it was, let's say, incredibly interesting and engaging, again, just because it takes so long to play through it, I wouldn't give it that same amount of time or respect if I were to go back to it a second time. I just couldn't do it. So let me know what you guys think. Again, we're going to have a second part to this video series where we're going to be discussing more about modern game design and how most people actually don't complete the games that they play. And I think the number right there is actually going to shock you to see the actual percentage of people who actually beat their games. So we'll get into that later on this week. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching.